Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our sew along. First of all, a couple of weeks ago, I said I would talk about how to make sure that you're getting an accurate quarter-inch seam allowance, and I haven't really talked about that, so I wanted to talk about that first tonight. We're going to be doing Block 37 card trick, and we'll be talking about that in just a minute. So first of all, if you don't own painter's tape, it's a handy little tool in your sewing room. And I use it for lots of different things. But I wanted to talk about how I check if I'm sewing on a different machine than I'm used to so that I get an accurate seam allowance. So I'm going to go to the needle camera so you can see. Oops. Let me turn off the light. When I'm just sewing by myself, the light's kind of helpful. But for your vision in the demo, it's better to have it off. So I have some painter's tape here, and I'm actually using a quarter-inch patchwork foot that is designed to go with this machine. But for instance, if you happen to have a machine that doesn't have a patchwork foot, or you just want to check the accuracy of your foot, this is something you can do. Now, first of all, I will tell you that not all machines are equal from machine to machine, even on the same brand and model. But I start out by rolling my needle up and putting a ruler underneath the needle with the needle just barely touching a quarter-inch mark on that ruler. So I've got a ruler wider than my sewing area just because I want to make sure that when I get it on here, I have it straight with the bed of the machine. I'm looking at the edge of the machine over here. There's a little seam in the underneath the foot plate. So I know that my ruler is straight. If my ruler is off a little bit like that, I'm never going to be able to put um, a mark here to be able to make sure that I'm straight. So I can see that with that needle on the quarter-inch line, the edge of my foot is right at the edge of that ruler. But that means if I can see any fabric on this edge of the foot, I'm taking a bigger seam than I need. So I want to be careful about that. Once I know my ruler is straight, I can take a piece of painter's tape and actually put it on the bed of my machine right along the edge of that ruler. Once I get that on there, I'm just going to tear it off. So that means that all the way out to the edge here, if I have my fabric lined up at the edge of that piece of tape, all the way to the needle, it's maintaining that accurate quarter-inch seam allowance. And you'll notice it's actually about halfway over into the feed dog area. So I want to make sure that I don't have any tape at my feed dog. So I'm just going to cut a little tiny little notch right there at the feed dogs so that I don't have any tape sticking to my feed dogs. But if I have a piece of fabric, let me grab a piece of fabric and show you. If I have a piece of fabric that I'm feeding through there and it's not lined up along that tape all the way out, I can be assured that I'm probably not going to have an accurate, consistent seam allowance because I can have an accurate seam allowance here, and if I don't maintain that all the way out, it won't be consistent. If you've ever seen a seam where you have some thin places and some thick places, that won't be as accurate as you want. Another thing you can do is take your painter's tape and lay it down on a cutting area. I've got it on my cutting mat. I'm ignoring the lines on the mat and I'm just using the line on my ruler, and I can actually cut a quarter-inch strip off of that. I can glance at that and see whether I'm doing an accurate quarter-inch seam allowance. I can lay a seam allowance of something I've sewn next to that, and if it's wildly wider than that, I know I'm taking too big of a bite. If it's wildly narrower than that, I'm not taking a big enough bite. Because it is designed so that when you have pieced sections matching up with unpieced sections, they should be able to be sewn together and be accurate. So I generally have a little piece of tape just stuck to my machine. And that's just a quick visual to remind you that you need to be consistent with your seam allowance the whole way through. So that's one way of making sure you have an accurate quarter inch seam allowance. Some people also take 2 or 3 layers of tape and just stack them on top of each other where they have a ridge right here. I tend not to do that because I have found that often what I tend to do is push against that ridge to the point that I'm actually over my tape and I'm not accurate anymore. So after you get used to where on your machine your best quarter inch seam allowance is, you may not need that piece of tape, but I'm going to leave it there for right now just so you can see how that might be useful with your sewing. So tonight, first of all, before I get started on the block we're going to be doing, I wanted to talk a little bit about a way you can use your Tucker trimmer for cutting the pieces that you need for whatever block you're making, especially if you need a bunch of squares. So I have a block that I'm pre-cutting for later, and in that block I need a 2 and a half, I'm sorry, 2 4.5 inch squares of my light blue and 4 2 inch squares of my light blue. So I just happen to have a chunk here. It's actually 2 chunks laying back to back. And I need 2 4.5 inch chunks. So I've got the 4.5 inch mark on my Tucker trimmer. And I'm going to cut up and over. Then I'm going to turn and I'm going to line up the 4.5 inch mark on my Tucker trimmer with the edges that I just cut. So when I get that cut, I know that I'm prepared with 2 4.5 inch squares for my project. Now I also said I need 4, I've got a little bit of selvage in that, but it's going to get trimmed, so I'm not going to worry about it. I also need 4 2 inch squares. So all I need to do is turn this around so that I'm getting the whole icon, the whole circle icon. I can cut 2 sides and then just carefully turn this around and cut the other 2 sides just from that same chunk of fabric. Now, of course, you have to make sure that you have enough fabric to do this, but just folding that over gives me 4 squares for that other part that I need for the project. And then I have a strip that I need 4 4.5 inch squares. So I'm going to use the half circle icon again because half is in the measurement name. And I could actually fold this and cut 4 at a time, but I just want to show you if you have a strip and you're wanting to true up some squares, there's 2 of them, and I'm just going to twist around. I often cut the squares needed for our Blockbuster blocks with my Tucker trimmer. It works very well. So there's 2 of them, and I'm just going to true up the other 2. I'm just making it a little bit oversized so I can trim it and make sure that all my edges are nice and straight. So that gives me 4 4.5 inch squares for my block. And if you're cutting squares that are half and whole inch measurements, your Tucker trimmer will take care of that. If you need something that's 1/4 or 3/4, the Tucker trimmer 2 will do those. So that is another use for your Tucker trimmer tool. So tonight's block is called Card Trick. And it's got several pieces that are reviewed. We're going to talk about how I got the pieces that you see on the block here. And then we'll talk about how you arrange the different pieces to make the project. So you can, of course, change the color combinations. And we're going to be talking more about that in a minute. Right now, I want to talk about the half squares. And on this particular color combination, I have 2 red half squares and 2 blue half squares. And I've actually kind of pre-made part of it. So first of all, I'm just going to take this off of here so you can see where we're headed. I want to just give you a quick visual of the chart for the Tucker trimmer, just as a review. So in this particular block, we're going to have some half square units as well as some combo units. So I've written over on the side of the chart just a little guide, a reminder that if you are making half square units, you start with squares 1 inch larger than the finished size you want. If you're making combo units, you start with squares 1.5 inches larger than your finished size. So that's important to remember. But when you're doing the blockbuster patterns, the cutting guide is going to give you your cutting amounts. So on this, I happen to have prepared a square of my red and the background and a square of the navy and the background. I've used the magic wand and I've drawn my 2 lines. I have stitched on the lines and now I'm ready. Uh-oh, I just dropped my whole little plate. Let me get it. So what I'm going to do now is just cut between my stitching lines. And I'm going to do that on both colors. And of course, you don't have to use the color combinations I've used. You could change your colors. You could have all 4 of your half squares the same color. That would be perfectly fine. But I've chosen 2 red and 2 blue, 2 navy. And I'm going to, first of all, finger press it just to kind of get the seam going the way I want it to. And I'm going to do all 4 of my half squares, get them ready for the iron. The iron's heating while I'm doing this, so I'm not wasting time. And I have better success if I do just a little finger pressing first, because I can make sure that my seams are aiming the way I want them to go, and I don't end up with little tucks along my seam that I wasn't prepared for. Once I get them finger pressed and ready, then I can set my iron on it and just kind of slide it over the top of all of them. Then if you're going to use the acorn pressing pin, I would just give it a little swipe down all 4 of those seams. Just keep going. So if half squares are what you're after, at this point you're ready to trim. There's not another sewing step. So if you were going to make combo units out of this, you would take one of these squares and add it. And of course, it would have been a different size. Keep that in mind. But then you would add the half square unit to a solid square, and you would stitch across the original seam. Then that would give you the combo unit you're after. We're going to do it a little bit differently today, and I'll show you that in just a minute. So I'm ready to trim these. All of my units in my block are 4-inch finished units. So I have a 4-inch finished half square for the corner, a 4-inch combo unit for the sides, and I have a snail's trail block. We're going to talk about that in a minute for the center. So, excuse me, I'm going to put the line on my Tucker trimmer. I got it upside down. I'm going to put the line on the seam, and I'm going to trim that to 4.5 inches. So I want to make sure that I have the half circle icon at the top right of my square. If you're left-handed, you're going to turn it to the top left. And I just turn my unit 180 degrees, line up the 4.5-inch line on my cut edges, line up the diagonal line on my seam so that I'm ready to trim, and I have a perfectly trimmed half square unit for my block. And I would do that with all 4 of these. I'm going to skip on to the next step because this is something we've done before, and you can always go back and watch previous videos if you need to see that again. So that's how you do the corners. Something else that you can be aware of, you don't have to turn the corners where the color is on the inside. Check out what happens when I turn it. You automatically see a star. And you could certainly arrange your blocks that way. You could even switch your colors so that the reds kind of offset each other. So the blue matches up with the red on the corner, and the red matches up with the blue on the corner. So that is one combination of how you could put these pieces together. So we're going to talk a little bit about the combo units. We have done combo units before where all 4 units were the same fabrics. And you might remember that they are all a mirror image. So if one leans right, the next one to it would lean left. We're going to kind of get around that. There is a technique sheet called non-mirror combo units. And we're actually going to do non-mirror combo units this time, but we're going to do it just a little bit differently. And I actually ended up with more squares than I really need for this. To do this technique, I need 1 square of red, 1 square of blue, and 1 square of background. So looking at my 4 combo units, I have a quarter square. That's a triangle that's a quarter of the unit. I have a background quarter square on all 4 units. I have a navy quarter square on 2 of the units, and I have a red quarter square on 2 of the units. So this is how I would approach that. I would take, I'm going to do the background square first. I'm going to cut it diagonally twice. So I'm going to cut up, and then without moving anything, I'm going to line up, excuse me, point to point, and I'm going to cut so that I have 4 quarter square triangles. This is where they belong. I'll just lay them here like that. Now I need 2 red quarter squares and 2 navy quarter squares. So that means when I cut this, I'm going to end up, if I continue and cut it like I did the background one, I'm actually going to have 4 quarter squares. I don't need 4, I just need 2. So I'm going to cut that in half, and then I'm going to turn it so that I can line up a horizontal line on the base of that triangle and match up on the point here. And once I get that in place, I'm going to cut again. That's going to give me 2 quarter square triangles. There's the other part of that square. And so this one's going to go here, and this one's going to go here. I'm going to have this left over. I'm just going to lay it aside because I'm not going to need it for what I'm going to do. I'm going to do the same thing, and I think I'll cut sideways across here because my first step is to just cut that in half. I'm going to get rid of this for right now because I'm not going to need it for what I'm going to do. And I'm going to line up a horizontal line on my ruler on the edge of my triangle and line up at the point. And remember, this is oversized, so it's going to get trimmed. So there's 2 quarter squares, 1 here and 1 here. So I'm going to also need a blue square and a red square. And you'll see why in a minute. I'm going to lay those other squares aside because I don't need them. So I'm going to take all of this to the sewing area so I can show you what I do next. All right, so let me change my camera so you can see. So here's my mock-up of my block. I'm trying to move things around so you can see it and see what I'm doing. So I am going to sew these 2 quarter square triangles together. So this is a quarter of the square, this is a quarter of the square, and I'm going to need a half square of blue later. But I want to make sure that these are lined up in this position. So I'm just going to flip the background triangle over, and I'm going to sew from this point out to the tip. I'm not worried that they don't match up because this is going to be trimmed. So let's go to the sewing machine, and here's the tape that I placed on, and I want to sew as accurately as possible. I should have put, yep, I should have put a fabric tag under there because it did not like doing that. Let me see if I can get it to turn loose. There we go. I just got a little ahead of myself. Hang on. By the way, it's time to clean your machine if you didn't clean it over the weekend because this is a new month. It's a good habit to get yourself into. This is another good habit. Sew onto a fabric tag so that you can sew from this onto the corner of whatever you're sewing, and that gives less issues with connecting there. So I'm just making sure that I'm aligned along this piece of tape all the way out to the point. And remember, if it doesn't match up exactly here, it's not a problem because it's going to get trimmed anyway. I'm aiming for the 1/4 inch there. So I'm just going to line up along here. So now the next one I need to put is this set. I need to make sure they're in this orientation. So I'm just going to flip my background fabric over the navy fabric. And I'm going to stitch from here out to the point. I'm going to do that again. And I'm lined up along my tape, believe it or not. There you go. I'm sewing all the way out to the end. And this one is the same way. I need to match up the point here. It's a good idea to lay it out so you can see what it's going to end up being before you stitch it. Make sure I have the right sides together because my background fabric is a chameleon. Sometimes you can't tell whether you got the front or the back. And I'm sewing along the edge here. Even if you have a patchwork foot and you're pretty consistent with lining up along here, sometimes having the tape out in front of where you're working, that gets you set up for the right space when you get to the needle. So this is my last one. I need to match up here and sew out to the point. Lining up along the tape. If you have chosen to put 2 or 3 layers of tape and you have a ridge here, you can't count on that to keep you straight if you're not paying attention along here anyway. So I've got all 4 of those done. Let's just grab my fabric tag and park my needle. And we're going to cut these apart. And I'm going to finger press them and I'll show you what that looks like, and then I'll place them back on there and show you that. I want to press toward the darker fabric, so I'm going to open that up, and I don't want to be real rambunctious with my pressing. I'm just giving it a finger press along there, and I'm going to do that with this. On this, the reason you cut quarter squares the way I did is so that the bias of your squares will be where it belongs, on the inside of that square. Here's another one. And I'm not going to take the time to go to the iron and press these for a couple of reasons. First of all, I only have 4 units that I'm working with. Second of all, sometimes when you take these units that have a long bias edge that's exposed, that's when you distort your blocks, when you take them to the ironing surface and over handle them. So I just don't handle them a lot. Now on this particular block for my combo units, I'm going to need a plain solid square of my red to match up with the 2 blue sections. And I'm going to need a plain solid square of my blue to match up with my red sections. So once I get that situated, notice when I put them face to face like this, the 2 reds are on opposite ends of my square. Now, this is a good time to grab a couple of pins because you want those to just kind of stay put so that you can glide across them. Notice I didn't have to draw any sewing lines on doing it this way. I'm going to do the same thing with the opposite combination. I'll put my blue quarter square triangle on top of my red, line up the other blue quarter square triangle on top of the red. And notice it's actually smaller than my red square. That works in my favor because I can make sure that when I get through stitching, I have plenty of room to trim all the way around the outside of that unit and end up with a 4.5 inch trimmed unit. So now I'm using the edge of my presser foot to guide my 1/4 inch. Now this is a place where that tape along the bed of your machine is not helpful because you can't see it. So that's why you have to get to the point that you know where your 1/4 inch seam allowance is if you're using a particular patchwork foot, or you're going to have to some way mark your 1/4 inch seam allowance along the edge. And you can actually see that my triangle is following right along the edge of that tape. So after you get a little bit into that square, you can see that I'm still lined up properly with my tape. And I'm going to do the same thing with the other one. Slide right along there. Let me move this pin because it's going to be in my way. I pinned it. If you can control your pieces without pinning, that's perfectly fine too. A lot of times I don't pin. And now I'm going to turn it around and come down the other side. Now you could do the non-mirror combo unit technique, but you're still going to end up with extra blue and red that you're not going to need. So I kind of like to do it this way because I can make sure that I have them on the correct side so my combo units lean the way I want them to lean when I get to that point. And here's my last one. Got to turn it around the right way. Rid of that pin. If you sew over pins, slow down so you don't jam your machine. So once you get those stitched, just park your needle and you're ready to cut these apart and trim. So we're going to go to the overhead camera so you can see what that process looks like. So my first step is we're just going to check it real quick to make sure it looks right. And it does. So I'm going to cut in between my two quarter square units. Do the same thing with this one. And this gives me the color combinations I want for my block. So I'm going to press toward my half square triangle. It's half of my square, and these two are a quarter of my square. That's where I got my terminology. And we call that a combo unit. So I'm still giving it a little finger press before I set the iron on it. That gives it a little bit of time underneath the iron. And remember, I did not press this with the iron yet, my quarter square. So I'm going to need to make sure that my iron actually lands on top of that quarter square seam as well. Once you get that done, then if you're using the acorn pressing pin, would be the time you use it because all of your bias edges are contained on the inside of your unit. All of the outside edges of this square are straight of the grain. So you have a much better chance of keeping everything nice and straight and square. So once you get that done, you're ready to trim your combo units. And I'm going to show you with the Tucker trimmer how to do that. So here's my Tucker trimmer. I'm trimming to a 4.5-inch square. And you have two seams that are diagonal in the unit, and there's a center point I want to maintain. So I'm looking for the 4.5-inch line and the solid line. So the 4.5 line is a dashed line, and where it crisscrosses over that center line, I know that belongs right on the center of my unit. Once I get the long dashed line on the 4.5-inch line on that seam and line up the bold solid line on this seam, and it meets in the center, I know that I'm safe to trim up and over, and the seams will go right into the corners the way I want them to and turn 180 degrees. And see, I have plenty of room to trim. I'm not having to fuss with it. I've got the 4.5-inch line here and here, the 4.5-inch diagonal line, and I've met in the center so that I know when I trim this, the center point is maintained in my unit. And so it's a 4.5-inch unit with the center precisely where it belongs. And so I'm going to do the same thing with this. It really doesn't particularly matter which seam goes where, as long as your diagonal lines crisscross, meet in the center, and you're aiming for the 4.5-inch trim lines so that your combo unit is the correct size. So I've trimmed one of each color combination just so you can see it. And I would do that, of course, with the other two so that I have 4 combo units for those side pieces in my block. So we'll talk more about those in a minute. But I want to talk now about this center unit. It's actually a stacked square. A stacked square is a technique sheet that you can get. We carry it. We have it here at the shop. And it gives you a couple of things. First of all, there's a level of difficulty indicator right here at the top. It has stars that tell you kind of their estimation of how difficult this unit is. It also has an icon that shows you which tool you need for that unit. Now, it does say large square squared, but as long as what you're making is no bigger than 6 inches, it will work with the original sized square squared. So I have the original size, and I've added a couple of marks on here that are important in making the stacked square. One is at the top of the tool where the window templates for the sizes of the centers, I put an A. If you're using the large square squared, it has one tool, one piece of plastic that has the A on it with all of the sizing window templates. And then the other end that has all the X's for the trim up, I've labeled that B. And if you're using the large square squared, it already has one of the tools that has the B on it. That's important for what you're going to be doing, because even though the seams make this difficult to see, there's a little 4 patch in the center. There's 4 little triangles stitched on, and then there's 4 more triangles stitched on. And I'm going to show you how to do that. My first step is to trim the center, and all of this sizing information is on the stacked square technique sheet. So my first step is to trim the very center unit using the center for a 2-inch half or a 2-inch unit right in the center. I said that wrong. I want to do that with my Tucker trimmer. I'm going to trim just my 4 patch, and I've got to find it because remember I dropped my plate a minute ago. There it is. So I want to trim this unit. It was made oversized on purpose, but I want to trim it to a 2.5-inch square. And I'm actually just going to line up the crisscross right on the center. And then I'm also using the little lines on here to make sure that I'm nice and square, because this needs to be cut to a 2.5-inch square. So I'm going to cut it, turn 180 degrees, and trim that to 2.5 inches. If you own the 4-patch square up tool, that would also do this. But just for one square, you can use your tucker trimmer. You can use the end of a 6x12. So that is the center that goes here. Now, when you're trimming this, we're going to add some little triangles here, and that's what's going to go right in the center. I've got it turned just so you can see. And you want to make sure that you line up the triangles in the manner that they show in the picture. So I have two small squares, and all I'm going to do is cut them in half, just point to point. And that's going to end up being here on the sides. They're oversized on purpose because I can trim them down. And I'm going to do the same thing with the blue square. And it's going to line up here. Once I get that stitched on, I'm going to trim the whole thing. Then I'm going to do the same thing again. I've got my red and my blue square stacked so that when I cut, there's my red triangle, my blue triangle, my red triangle, my blue triangle. So that's where I'm headed. So it creates that kind of monkey wrench, snail's trail combo. I'm just going to pick the whole thing up and carry it to the sewing area. And then I'll change cameras here. Jessica says she's back. She's missed everything. She's been gone a long time, or she's been busy. So I am ready to sew on the center. So there's my sample, just so you can see. There's my red triangle, and I want to put it on here so it matches that. It's not going to be a big deal if you get it in a different arrangement, but if you want it to look like the picture, you do need to refer to the picture. So the triangle goes on bottom, the square goes on top because the triangle is the oversized part. The square is trimmed to size, so it's not actually going to get trimmed. But I'm going to stitch right along the edge, and notice I'm going to line up right along that piece of tape. I generally don't sew with a piece of tape here, but I wanted you to kind of see what that would look like if I did. Get rid of that. And we're going to stitch onto my fabric tag. I'm going to get the other red triangle because they're going to be opposite each other, like that. And I'm going to just center my triangle on there. The ears are going to stick out, and they're oversized so that I can trim that off later. So I'm just going to thread there that's going to be in my way. Let's get rid of that. And I'm stitching right along the edge at my 1/4 inch. You want to put the square on top because it is already cut to size. There are a few units that you make that parts of it are already cut to size, and you always want to put those on top where you can see them as they feed through your machine. So I'm just going to finger press this, and then I'm going to add the blue triangles, and they're going to go on the opposite sides. So the square goes on top, triangle goes on bottom next to your feed dogs, and it overlaps because I'm using the square on top as my guide to feed that through. And then I'm going to get the last triangle and just center it on there. Should have about the same amount of ears on both sides so that when you stitch it, it's evenly spaced. And I can also kind of attend to my seam allowances and make sure that they don't get flipped the wrong way, because on this, I want all of this to be pressed out from the center. So let's go to the overhead camera so you can see how you press and what you trim on this. So the first thing I'm going to do is give this a little press. Start with the finger press. And then I'm going to just set the iron on it. And if you're using the acorn pressing pen, now would be the time to use it. The only sad thing about this is you're not going to be able to see my intersections real well with the dark fabric, but I'll show you what I'm lining up to. So now I'm going to be trimming. This is actually pretending to be the center of a 4.5-inch finished unit. So all I have to do is use the A section of my tool. Normally, when you're trimming the triangles off of a square squared, you'd be using this side, the B side where all the X's are. But this is the center of a 4.5-inch finished unit, or 4-inch finished unit. So it says right here, center for 4-inch finished unit. So normally you would have cut that from a 3.5-inch strip or a 3.5-inch square. There are several little marks here. Those little slash marks. There's 2 on the north and south and 2 for east and west. They actually line up on those intersections so that when you trim, you want to lay this down like a square. The mistake I see people make when they're trying to trim the center part of a stacked square is they try to lay it this way because they're orienting to this square in the center. You actually need to ignore the square in the center right now and line it up so it still looks like a square, and find all the little slash marks for the size you want. Mine's the 4-inch finish, so you can see there's actually also a dashed line that lines up on those seams right there. So I've got the little slash marks. I'm going to see if I can pull this down and still have it in focus enough for you to see that. Okay, so see the little dash lines? That one goes on the intersection. That's on an intersection. The glare from the camera make it harder to see, but that's also on an intersection. And this one's on an intersection. But that gives me exactly what I need to line that up so I can trim it. I'm going to try to turn it this way so you can actually see close as I'm trimming. I think that's probably as good as I'm going to be able to do so you can see. So I'm lining up on the dashed lines and those little slash halfway points. And I'm going to trim up and over. When you do that, I'm automatically a 1/4 inch from the edge there, the way I want to be. And I'm going to flip around, line up on the center square for 4-inch finished units. And again, I'm looking for the dashed line along here and the little slash marks. And I'm going to trim up and over. Once I get that done, that is actually the center for a 4.5-inch finished unit. So I'm going to take this back to the sewing area, and I'm going to leave that camera down low like that so when I come back you can see as well as possible. So here is my unit, and that's what I'm headed for. I've left my triangles there. This is my sample. So I'm going to, first of all, grab my center unit and one of my triangles. I'm trying to get my camera to come down. It just wants to flip back up. There we go. So I'm going to put the triangle on the proper side. That's one reason why you want to lay it out so it looks right before you stitch it. And I'm just using the edge of my presser foot, and this time I can actually use my tape as well. And there is an intersection right here where this seam comes across and meets that seam. Where that intersection is, I want my needle to go right on that intersection. And you'll be able to see it in your own sewing room. I don't know that you can see it on the camera. But I'm going to part my needle and stitch the other one on. So I have ears sticking out on both sides. I'm going to stitch right onto the triangle. And again, I'm looking for that intersection where this seam meets this seam. I want to stitch right over that intersection. And you'll often see me with my fingertips on top of a seam allowance. That is so that the seam allowance doesn't flip on me issue. So my next step will be to finger press this. And you can see there where the corner of my square meets the edge of that triangle. That's what you want. There it is again. The corner of the square meets the triangle. And if you're if you're using lighter fabric, you can see that a lot more clearly. But you still want it to be as precise as possible, even though you don't see it as clearly. So I'm going to line up. Now you can see that intersection I'm headed for, where this seam crosses this seam. I want to make sure that they line up, and I want my needle to come right across at that point. So this is where I was talking about. A lot of times you'll see me with my fingers right on those seam allowances. Some people use a stiletto or a seam ripper or a bent tip tweezer to make sure the seam allowances don't flip, or their scissors. So that is something you can do as you're feeding it through. You want to make sure that this seam allowance that goes through first doesn't flip up. And once you get that far, you want to make sure that this seam allowance stays put as you get through that seam. So I always have 2 or 3 little tools around me that will do the job, but whatever you get used to is what you need to use. This one's kind of handy because I can grab just the top layer of something. And I use that a lot for making sure my seam allowances go the way I want to. So, and Cheryl Lynn said the light bulb has just brightened up. I'm hoping that means something I've said has clicked and you understand it better. So right now we're going to line up the last triangle. I'm after that intersection where the seams crisscross, and I'm going right across that. Remember, the triangle is oversized. It's going to get trimmed. I want to make sure I hit that intersection right there. And like I said, with the bent tip tweezers, you can smooth things out and line those up. Those are an inexpensive little tool. We generally have one at all of our machines because you can also take stitches out with it because it's pretty sharp. So I'm ready to park my needle, and I am finished with my stacked square unit. We're going to take this to the ironing surface and press it, and then we're going to trim it. So I'm first of all going to press it. I'm not going to move the camera because I want, well, I can do it this way. I want the camera to stay put so you can actually see. I've got to change cameras. Excuse me, I got ahead of myself. All right, so I've got my 4 triangles added. I'm going to flip it back and finger press. I'm going to kind of talk about your seams. Where it crisscrosses, that's where that seam should have been. This is the first one that we stitched, the first square, and that little 4 patch that's in the center belongs there. I'm going to move this out from under the camera and press it really quickly, and then I'll bring it back to show you where I line up to trim. If you're going to use the acorn pressing solution, this is when you would add that. It's always a handy little thing, just a small step that will increase accuracy and make your piecing even more precise. So there's my unit. You can see the seams a little better. And when I lay my tool on here to trim, I'm looking for specific intersections. We're not seeing anything. I don't know why, because I couldn't see it there either for a second. So I'm after these intersections. Now I'm looking for the side of the tool that has all the X's on it with the numbers. So this is a 4-inch finished unit. That means all of the X's that say 4 are what I want to line up on those intersections. So there's the X that says 4, it's on the top. I've got X's that say 4 on the sides. I'm going to back out a little bit so you can see all of them. There's the 4 on the side. There's the 4 on the side, and there's actually one on the bottom as well. So this is how you would normally trim a 4-inch finished square squared. It's just that this one has some piecing in there. The snail, it is not. Check it out. That's what it's supposed to be like. And the way that happened was I just grabbed the blue triangle and stitched it on and didn't make sure that I had it going in the snail. So you can see you don't want to do this, but I am going to go ahead and trim it just so you can see this one's not really usable in this unit if I want it to look like the others. But after you get your intersections lined up with those 4s, then when you trim it, it will be a 4.5-inch unit, and yours should look like this. So that's the first mistake I've made all day. So this is the center of my snail's trail, the center of my card trick block, and I'm going to go back to the center of this unit. So you can see how that turned out. I'm going to move the camera up so you can see the whole thing, because we're going to talk about color placement and adaptations you can make. So it kind of has the little star thing going on. I created that simply by switching those corners around to the outside. So I'm going to just flip them back so you can see what it looked like when I first started. And you get to choose. If you have looked ahead at the card trick pattern, you've already seen some different color combinations that you could put together. But you can also change the color combinations of your units. So I've put a light blue instead of the navy in the center. I've also switched the units. I've got pins here and I forgot I had them. Let me get those out of the way. You can switch the units that are on the side, the color combinations. Now this one I need to switch something else. Hang on a second. So that this is right. So that it still creates that snail from the center out. So you can create a different combination that way. If you did this one and flip these out, then you have that little crisscross star in the center using a lighter blue. So when you're looking at your cutting instructions, it's going to give you what you need for the half squares that are on the corners. It'll give you what you need for the combo units, and you get to decide what color combinations you use. This one I had all navy blue for my quarter square unit, and then I had the light blue and the red for the half square portion of that. And then you would just change the color combinations of the snail's trail in the middle. So you have lots and lots of options. It creates basically a new block using the same pattern, just a different arrangement of colors and fabrics. So anybody else have questions? Elaine gets the prize because she said, she said, is the snail going right? She caught it before. The blue that I'm using, yes, that's called Blossoms. It's a Riley Blake fabric. We do have that. So if you don't find it on our website, just call us tomorrow and we can fix you up. So until next week, happy sewing. Be sure and check out our YouTube channel if you didn't get to watch the whole thing or you need to see it again. Our YouTube channel is Sacred Creek Quilt, and like and share, and we'll see you next week live at 5. Bye-bye.